The unexpected meeting that changed everything. David Anderson adjusted the cuff of his tuxedo, scanning the grand ballroom with a mixture of anticipation and curiosity. The charity gala was in full swing, the air buzzing with laughter, clinking glasses, and the soft hum of an elegant orchestra. He had attended plenty of these high society events before, but something about tonight felt different, like something life-changing was on the horizon. As he reached for a flute of champagne from a passing server, his eyes landed on her. She stood near the grand staircase, illuminated by the soft golden light of the chandeliers. She wasn't just beautiful, she was radiant. Her deep brown skin glowed under the lights, her natural curls framed her delicate yet confident face, and when she laughed, it was a sound that turned heads. David felt his pulse quicken. He wasn't the only one mesmerized by her presence. Men and women alike stole glances her way, some admiring, others whispering behind their hands. She was different from the usual crowd, and in this elite circle, different wasn't always welcomed. Ignoring the murmurs, David made his way toward her. Summoning his courage, he extended a hand. "Hi, I'm David." She turned, meeting his gaze with deep brown eyes full of warmth and wisdom. A hint of surprise flickered across her face, but then she smiled, a smile that lit up the entire room. "Lisa," she said, her voice smooth as honey. She placed her hand in his, and the moment their fingers touched, a spark shot through him. "It's nice to meet you, Lisa." They began to talk, and within minutes, David was captivated, not just by her beauty, but by her mind. Lisa was a community organizer, passionate about helping underprivileged families. She spoke about her work with a kind of fervor that made his corporate world feel small in comparison. As the night wore on, they found themselves lost in conversation, oblivious to the passing hours. They talked about everything: her childhood in the city, his privileged upbringing, their dreams, their fears. David had never felt so comfortable with someone so quickly. It was like they had known each other for years. But then, reality set in. Lisa hesitated when he asked her to dinner. "David, are you sure?" she asked softly. "People might talk. It might not be easy for you to be seen with a black woman, let alone one with 3 kids. David's breath caught in his throat. He understood what she was saying. His world, his family, and his friends. They wouldn't approve. He had never thought much about race, but standing there in front of Lisa, the weight of societal expectations pressed down on him. He looked at her, this strong, beautiful, independent woman, and he knew. "I don't care what anyone thinks," he said firmly, taking her hand in his. "I just know I'd really like to get to know you better." Lisa studied him for a long moment, searching his face for any hesitation. Then, slowly, she smiled. "In that case," she said, her voice tinged with a mix of amusement and hope, "I'd love to have dinner with you." The shockwaves begin. David had never felt more alive than when he was with Lisa. Their first date was simple, a quiet Italian restaurant on the outskirts of town. No high society, no expensive wines, just them. Lisa was cautious at first, guarded even. But David was patient. He asked questions about her life, her kids, her dreams. He listened, not just to respond, but to understand. By the end of the night, he knew 2 things for certain. He was falling for her. Nothing would stop him from being with her. But not everyone was as open-hearted as David. The first wave of resistance came from his best friend, Tom. "You're serious about this?" Tom asked when David told him about Lisa. David leaned back in his chair, sensing the skepticism in Tom's voice. "Yeah, I am. She's amazing. Man." Tom hesitated, running a hand through his hair. "I mean, I get it. She's beautiful, she's smart. But Dave, think about your future. You know how people are going to react." David's jaw clenched. "I don't care how people react. Your family will." And they did. Facing the family. It was a sunny Saturday afternoon when David decided to introduce Lisa and her 3 kids to his family. They arrived at the Andersons' annual summer barbecue, a tradition where everyone in his tight-knit, upper-class community gathered to enjoy grilled steaks, cold beer, and polite small talk. Lisa held her head high as they stepped onto the lush green lawn, her 3 children standing close. Jasmine, 14, poised and intelligent, surveyed the crowd warily. Malik, 10, clung to his mother's side, his eyes full of curiosity. Ella, 6, bounced excitedly, unaware of the tense stares sent their way. David tightened his grip on Lisa's hand. This was it. Everyone, David announced, trying to keep his voice steady. I'd like you to meet Lisa and her wonderful children. For a moment, silence. Then his mother Eleanor stepped forward, forcing a tight-lipped smile. Welcome, she said, her voice betraying her discomfort. His father George, however, wasn't as welcoming. He folded his arms, eyes scanning Lisa and the kids before finally saying, Lisa, what do you do for a living? Lisa didn't miss a beat. I run a small bakery. It's been in my family for generations. George simply nodded, his face unreadable. Some of David's relatives muttered amongst themselves, disapproval clear in their expressions. His Aunt Martha pursed her lips. His cousin whispered something under her breath. But Tom, his best friend, was different. He stepped forward with a genuine smile and shook Lisa's hand. It's great to finally meet you, he said warmly. David hasn't shut up about you for weeks. Lisa smiled back, gratitude flashing in her eyes. As the barbecue went on, the division in the crowd became obvious. Some engaged in conversation with Lisa and the kids, making an effort to be welcoming. Others kept their distance, throwing subtle, disapproving glances their way. At one point, Jasmine, the eldest, leaned close to her mother and whispered, Mom, I don't think everyone wants us here. Lisa gently squeezed her daughter's shoulder. Change takes time, sweetheart. David overheard and felt a wave of anger and sadness. His family, the people who had raised him, were looking at the woman he loved and her children like outsiders. But as he gazed at Lisa, standing tall despite the judgment, he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to let them drive her away. No matter what it took, no matter who stood in their way. He was all in. The storm before the sunrise. The fallout begins. The moment they left his parents' barbecue, David knew things would never be the same. Lisa was quiet on the drive home, staring out the window, her fingers lightly tapping against her lap, a sign that she was processing everything. Jasmine sat in the backseat with her arms crossed. Malik was staring at the floor, and little Ella, still blissfully unaware, was humming a soft tune. David cleared his throat, trying to break the tension. That wasn't so bad, right? Lisa turned to him with a raised eyebrow. You really believe that? David exhaled, gripping the steering wheel tighter. I mean, my mom was civil, and Tom was great. Lisa let out a soft laugh, but it wasn't out of amusement. It was disbelief. Civil, she repeated. David, your father barely looked me in the eye. Your aunt acted like I was invisible, and I caught at least 3 people whispering the moment we walked in. David's heart sank. He had hoped, somehow, that things would go smoother. That maybe people would put aside their biases and just see Lisa for the incredible woman she was. I'm sorry, he said quietly. Lisa sighed, softening slightly. I knew this wouldn't be easy. But I just wanted them to see me, not just my skin color or the fact that I have kids. David hated that she even had to say that. They will, he promised. They just need time. But deep down, a voice whispered, what if they never do? The breaking point. The real blow came 3 days later when David received an unexpected visit at his office. He was in the middle of a meeting when his assistant, Sarah, knocked on the door. Mr. Anderson, she said hesitantly, your parents are here to see you. David's stomach dropped. He knew why they were here. He wrapped up the meeting quickly, took a deep breath, and walked out to the reception area where George and Eleanor Anderson were waiting, his father looking stern, his mother with a carefully constructed mask of concern. "Mom." "Dad," he greeted, forcing a smile. "What brings you here?" His father wasted no time. "Son, we need to talk. Now." David led them into his office, closing the door behind him. He barely had time to sit before his father started. "This situation with Lisa, it has to stop." David's jaw tightened. "Excuse me." George leaned forward, his voice low and commanding. "We've been talking to some of our friends. People are concerned. They're talking, David, and not in a good way." His mother sighed, placing a hand on his arm. "Sweetheart, you have to think about your future, your reputation, your career." David pulled back, his blood boiling. "So let me get this straight. You're worried about what some snobby country club members think. About appearances, while I've met the love of my life." His father scoffed. "Love? David, you barely know this woman. I know she's kind. I know she's strong. I know she's raising 3 incredible kids. And I know she's better than any person sitting around whispering behind our backs." His mother pursed her lips. "David, we're just trying to look out for you." "If you were," David said coldly, "you'd be happy for me." His father exhaled through his nose, frustration evident. "Son, listen to reason. There are plenty of women who would fit into our world." "Our world," David repeated, feeling sick. "You mean a white woman? That's what you're saying, right?" His father didn't deny it. Instead, he simply stood, straightened his blazer, and said the words that cut deeper than David could have ever expected. "If you stay with her, you will no longer be our son." His mother gasped softly, as if she hadn't expected that. But George didn't waver. "You have a choice, David," he said, his voice like steel. "Your family, or her." David clenched his fists, trying to steady his breath. He had always admired his father, a man of strong principles, a man who built an empire from nothing. But in this moment, all he saw was a man willing to throw away his own son because of his own ignorance. David stood, his eyes burning. "I already made my choice." His mother covered her mouth, shaking her head. But his father simply nodded, as if David had confirmed his worst fears. "Then don't bother coming home." With that, George turned and walked out, his polished shoes echoing through the room. His mother lingered for a second longer, looking at David with tear-filled eyes. "Please," she whispered, "don't do this." But David lifted his chin. "I love her, Mom. If you can't accept that, then maybe it's you who's making the mistake." She swallowed hard, hesitated, and then, just like his father, she walked out the door. And just like that, David lost his family. A new family. That night, David sat in Lisa's living room, staring blankly at the floor. Lisa was next to him, concern in her eyes. "What happened?" she asked softly. David let out a shaky breath. "They gave me a choice. Them or you." Lisa's expression fell. "David, I chose you," he interrupted, looking her straight in the eye. "I will always choose you." Tears welled up in Lisa's eyes. "You shouldn't have had to make that choice, David. I never wanted to come between you and your family." He took her hands, his grip firm. "They made that choice, not me." Jasmine, who had been listening from the doorway, walked forward. "So, you're staying?" she asked cautiously. David turned toward her, his voice gentle but unwavering. "Not just staying. I'm all in." A long silence stretched between them. Then, to his surprise, Jasmine's tough exterior cracked, just for a moment. She nodded, bit her lip, and then did something that stunned him. She hugged him. David froze for a second, then wrapped his arms around her, feeling all of it, the pain, the fear, the hope. And for the first time that night, he smiled. He may have lost one family today, but he had just gained another. A love that defied the odds. A home divided. David never thought he would become estranged from his own family. For years, his life had been defined by legacy, expectations, and duty. everything his father had built, everything his mother had instilled in him, the world of wealth and tradition that had shaped him. But now, that world had rejected him. His parents had cut him off completely. His childhood friends barely spoke to him. Even distant relatives, the ones who barely knew him, had heard about the scandal. David Anderson had fallen in love with a black woman with 3 kids, and in their world, that was unforgivable. The whispers followed him everywhere, the glances of pity, the voices filled with judgment. It wasn't just disapproval, it was condemnation. He had become the man who threw everything away for a woman they deemed unworthy. But every time he saw Lisa, every time he held her hand, every time he heard her laugh, every time he played with Jasmine, Malik, and Ella, he knew he had made the right choice, battling the world together. As the months passed, David's commitment to Lisa and the kids deepened. At first, Jasmine had been skeptical. She had seen men come and go in her mother's life, men who made promises but never stayed. She had learned not to trust easily. So when David started showing up every day, picking her and her siblings up from school, helping with homework, fixing things around the house, she was watching, waiting for him to leave. But he didn't. Even when people stared at them in public, even when the school mothers whispered behind Lisa's back, even when Malik's soccer coach suddenly benched him for no reason, David stayed. One evening, after David had spent the entire afternoon fixing a broken kitchen cabinet, Jasmine sat at the dining table, pretending to do homework. "You know," she said, not looking up from her book, "most guys would have left by now." David glanced up, surprised by her sudden honesty. "Most guys aren't me." Jasmine looked at him then, studying him the way only a teenage girl could. "You really love my mom, don't you?" David didn't hesitate. "With all my heart." Jasmine paused, then slowly nodded. Okay. It wasn't much. But for her, it was everything. The wedding that shook the town. When David and Lisa announced their engagement, the reaction was explosive. The town's response, divided. Half the people offered polite smiles and empty congratulations. The other half reacted with disgust, barely hiding their outrage. The Anderson family, still refusing to speak to David, made their stance clear. They would not be attending the wedding. Lisa's side, on the other hand, was overjoyed. Her sister, her best friends, people from her community all rallied around her. And yet the ugliness didn't stop. Lisa started receiving anonymous letters in her mailbox. Cruel, racist messages telling her she was a gold digger, that she was ruining David's life, that their children would be unwanted. David, furious, confronted some of the men in town, demanding they stop. But all he got was smirks and sneers. "Go ahead," one man laughed. "Marry her. See how long it lasts." David clenched his fists but didn't strike. He didn't need to. He'd let time prove them wrong. A vow that couldn't be broken. The wedding day arrived, a modest yet beautiful ceremony in a small chapel by the lake. Lisa, wearing a simple yet elegant ivory dress, walked down the aisle holding Malik and Ella's hands, while Jasmine stood proudly beside David. The moment she reached him, David took her hands, his eyes full of love. Their vows were not just promises, they were defiance. Defiance against bigotry. Defiance against doubt. Defiance against a world that had said they wouldn't make it. "I promise to love you," David whispered. "Through every storm, through every challenge, through every whisper behind our backs. Because none of that matters. You matter." Lisa's voice trembled as she spoke her vow. "You are my second chance at love, David. And you didn't just love me. You loved my children, too. That's a gift I will never take for granted." As they sealed their vows with a kiss, cheers erupted from Lisa's family. And in the back of the room, standing alone, was Eleanor Anderson, David's mother. Tears streamed down her face, but she never stepped forward. She simply turned and walked away. A new beginning. Despite everything, life after the wedding was beautiful. David officially adopted Jasmine, Malik, and Ella, legally making them his children. Lisa's bakery, which had been struggling due to the town's hostility, suddenly flourished, thanks to David's support and Lisa's incredible talent. But the challenges weren't over. Malik still faced discrimination on his soccer team. Jasmine overheard whispers at school, labeling her as not really part of the Andersons. David's business, which had taken a hit after the scandal, was struggling to recover. And yet, they kept going, because they had each other. One evening, as the kids played in the backyard, Lisa sat beside David on the porch. "Do you regret it?" she asked softly. David turned to her, his gaze full of conviction. "Not for a single second." Lisa exhaled, relief flooding her expression. "Neither do I." They clinked their glasses together, a quiet toast to their new life. They had lost so much. David had lost his parents, Lisa had lost her sense of security, the kids had lost friendships and acceptance. But what they had gained, a love that no one could take away, a love that had defied the odds. And as David looked at his wife, his children, his family, he knew one thing for certain. This was just the beginning. The battle for acceptance, a love worth fighting for. David and Lisa had expected challenges after their wedding, but neither of them was truly prepared for the full force of the backlash. If the town had been divided before, it was now a war zone of opinions. Some neighbors offered polite smiles but kept their distance. Others made no attempt to hide their disgust. Some even outright refused to acknowledge their existence. Lisa's bakery, once a hidden gem, was now being boycotted by certain families in town. David's business was losing clients, particularly the older, wealthier ones, people who had known his family for generations. At school, Malik found himself excluded from team events. Jasmine overheard teachers saying she was out of place in the advanced programs. Ella, too young to understand everything, just sensed that people were looking at them differently. It wasn't just whispers anymore. It was open rejection. But David refused to let it break them. "We won't run," he told Lisa one night as they lay in bed. "We won't give them the satisfaction." Lisa sighed, resting her head on his chest. "I know, but I hate seeing the kids suffer." He stroked her hair, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "They'll see one day. The people who doubt us, the people who think this is just some phase, they'll see." Lisa looked up at him, eyes searching. "And if they never do?" David's voice was steady. "Then we prove them wrong anyway." An unforgivable betrayal. Despite everything, David still hoped his parents would come around. Maybe they needed time. Maybe, after seeing his love for Lisa and the kids, they'd understand. But then, the lawsuit happened. It was a cold morning when David received the letter in the mail. At first, he thought it was some business paperwork, something about contracts or property. But as he read the first few lines, his stomach dropped. His parents were suing him for his inheritance. The Anderson fortune was built over decades, and David, as their only son, was meant to inherit everything. But now his parents were legally disowning him, cutting him out of the family trust, removing his name from every will and business record they owned. David's hands shook as he clenched the letter. They weren't just cutting him off. They were erasing him. Lisa found him sitting at the dining table, the letter in front of him, untouched food beside him. "David," she asked, concern in her voice. He didn't respond. Instead, he handed her the letter. She read it quickly, her eyes widening in horror. "Oh my God." David let out a dry, bitter laugh. They'd really did it. Lisa's hands tightened around the paper. "They're trying to hurt you." "Not just me," David muttered. "They want to send a message. They want everyone to know that I'm no longer their son." Lisa swallowed hard, sitting beside him. "David, I don't care about their money. I never did." "I know," he whispered. "But this isn't about the money, is it?" she asked, reading his expression. David closed his eyes, shaking his head. It's about the fact that they'd rather destroy me than accept you. Lisa reached out, holding his hand tightly. You still have a family, she said. Me. The kids. We're here. We're not going anywhere. David looked at her, and in that moment he knew. His parents could take everything, but they couldn't take this. They couldn't take her, or the love they had built. The fight for justice. David refused to let his parents win. He wouldn't fight them for the money. He didn't need it. But he wouldn't stay silent either. Instead of hiding, David and Lisa went public. They told their story. First, it was just a simple post online, a heartfelt letter David wrote about love, family, and prejudice. But the post exploded. Within hours, it had thousands of shares. Within days, news outlets were reaching out for interviews. A black woman and a wealthy white man, fighting against bigotry, defying the odds, standing strong despite hate and loss. The world paid attention. David and Lisa appeared on TV interviews, sharing their journey. Lisa spoke about the struggles she faced, how even in a town she had lived in for years, she was suddenly the outsider. David talked about his parents, the painful truth that blood ties didn't always mean love. And people listened. Messages flooded in, some filled with hate, but many more with support. Stay strong. Love always wins. We need more stories like yours. And then the unexpected happened. An old friend of David's father, a man of wealth and influence, reached out. I knew your father for years, the man said. I always respected him. But after seeing what he's done to you, he's lost my respect. That single phone call started a chain reaction. David's business, which had suffered since his family cut ties, exploded overnight. Suddenly, clients who had once abandoned him were returning, not out of pity, but because they admired his courage. Lisa's bakery, too, saw an unexpected turn. People from all over the state came to support her, wanting to buy from the woman who had stood strong in the face of hate. And the biggest shock, the lawsuit backfired. David's parents had tried to erase him, but all they had done was shine a light on their own ugliness. Their business partners pulled out. Their friends distanced themselves. And George Anderson, the man who had built his empire with an iron fist, found himself abandoned. Because in the end, hate destroys itself, and love endures, a family forged in fire. A year later, things had changed dramatically. David and Lisa weren't just surviving. They were thriving. Jasmine, once hesitant about David, now called him Dad without thinking twice. Malik, once pushed aside by his coach, became one of the best players on the team. Ella, always the innocent one, never doubted that they were a real family. And David had no regrets. One evening, as they sat around the dinner table, Lisa glanced at him and asked, "So, Mr. Anderson, do you still think this was worth it?" David smirked, every second of it. Jasmine grinned, even with all the drama. David chuckled, especially with the drama. Lisa laughed, shaking her head. Well, I hope you're ready for more, because this family, we never do things the easy way. David looked around the table, at the family he had chosen, at the love they had fought for, at the life they had built. And he smiled. Bring it on, he said, because this was just the beginning. The strength to stand tall, a community divided. Though David and Lisa had gained national attention, their small town remained split in two. Some saw them as pioneers, a couple proving that love transcended race and prejudice. Others, however, were angrier than ever, feeling that the attention David and Lisa had brought to their town was unwelcome. Lisa's bakery had a line out the door every morning, filled with supporters who had driven miles to taste her famous peach cobbler and buy from the woman who had become a symbol of resilience. But then, one night, someone broke the windows of her shop. David got the call from the police at 3 a.m. Lisa rushed to the bakery, her heart pounding as she and David pulled up to find the front glass completely shattered. Spray painted across the storefront were the words, "Go back where you belong." Lisa stood frozen, staring at the hateful message, her hands trembling. David clenched his fists, his blood boiling. Who the hell did this? The police had no suspects, no fingerprints, no cameras nearby. But David knew. It was the same people who had been whispering behind their backs, the ones who had tried to force them out since the beginning. Lisa swallowed, her voice steady but filled with pain. They think this will break me. David turned to her, his hands on her shoulders. It won't. She nodded slowly, determination replacing the pain. No, it won't. They spent the night cleaning up the glass and debris, scrubbing away the words of hate. By morning, something unexpected happened. The community fought back. Lisa arrived at the bakery that day to find dozens of volunteers, people she barely knew, standing outside with paint, tools, and supplies. One woman, an older white lady named Margaret, handed Lisa a fresh cup of coffee. "We're not letting them win," she said firmly. Another man, a younger black father with his daughter, held up a sign that read, "Love is louder than hate." Lisa's throat tightened with emotion. For every person who had tried to tear them down, 20 more were standing beside them. Within 2 days, the bakery had brand new windows, a fresh coat of paint, and a stronger presence than ever before. The hate crime had backfired. Instead of scaring Lisa away, it had made her unstoppable. Malik's fight for respect. Malik had always loved soccer. It was his escape, his passion, the place where he felt most free. But ever since David became his stepfather, his coach, a man named Coach Richards, had benched him. Week after week, he sat on the sidelines, watching other kids play, kids who weren't half as talented as him. At first, Malik didn't want to say anything. "I don't want to make a big deal out of it," he told David one afternoon. David knelt beside him, looking him in the eyes. "Malik, sometimes standing up for yourself is a big deal." Malik hesitated. "What if he kicks me off the team?" "Then we'll find another team," David said. "But you deserve to play." So, one day, David and Lisa marched into the school's athletic office. "Coach Richards," David said, his tone calm but firm, "we need to talk." The coach barely looked at him. "I decide who plays, Anderson." David folded his arms. "Then why is Malik, one of the best players on the team, not playing at all?" Richards smirked. "Maybe he's just not as good as you think." Lisa's eyes flashed with anger. "Or maybe you have a problem with the fact that he's my son now." The coach's smirk faded. "Look," he said, "I don't have time for politics. If the boy wants to play, he needs to prove himself." David stepped forward, his voice deadly serious. "Then let him prove himself. A fair shot. No bias. No excuses. One game. If he's not good enough, bench him. But if he is, you let him play." Richards narrowed his eyes. "Fine," he said after a long pause. "One game." That Saturday, Malik finally got his chance, and he blew everyone away. With speed, precision, and determination, he scored 2 goals and assisted another. By the end of the game, the crowd was chanting his name. Even the coach, grudgingly, had to admit it. The next game, Malik was starting forward. Jasmine's stand for equality. At school, Jasmine had always been a straightest student. She worked hard, studied harder, and had dreams of going to a top university. But one day, she came home furious. "They denied my scholarship application," she said, throwing the rejection letter on the table. Lisa picked it up, reading it carefully. "This doesn't make sense. You meet every qualification." Jasmine clenched her fists. "My teacher told me I wasn't a good fit." David narrowed his eyes. "What does that mean?" Jasmine exhaled sharply. "It means they don't think I should be in that program." Lisa and David shared a look. They had seen this before. Jasmine, the only black student in the honors program, had just been pushed aside. Lisa's hands tightened around the paper. We're fighting this. And they did. They went to the school board, demanding an explanation. The administrators stumbled over their words, trying to justify their unjustifiable decision. But Jasmine didn't need them. Because while they were blocking her, an Ivy League recruiter had been watching. A month later, Jasmine received an email. She had been offered a full scholarship, not from the school that had rejected her, but from a university that believed in her potential. She broke down in tears. David wrapped her in a hug. "Told you, kid. They can't stop you." She smiled through her tears. "No, they really can't." The Anderson family stands tall. The hate hadn't disappeared. There were still people who scowled when they walked down the street, still whispers in stores, still parents who refused to let their kids play with Malik and Ella. But David and Lisa had learned something. They didn't need everyone's approval. Because for every person who tried to bring them down, 10 more stood beside them. David's business was thriving again. Lisa's bakery had become a symbol of resilience. Jasmine was headed to a top university. Malik was a star on his team. And little Ella. She had never once questioned whether they were a real family. Because they were. And no one, not hate, not rejection, not even the people who would try to erase them, could ever take that away. Lisa stood on the front porch one evening, watching David play with the kids in the yard. She exhaled softly, feeling at peace. "Still worth it?" she asked. David turned, smiling at her, more than ever. Because in the end, love had won. A legacy built on love. Unbreakable bonds. 1 year after David and Lisa's wedding, life had transformed in ways neither of them could have imagined. The bakery was flourishing, the kids were thriving, and their love had only grown stronger. But the world wasn't done testing them. The scars of prejudice still ran deep in their town, and while some had learned to accept their family, others never would. And David was about to face his biggest battle yet, a father's last stand. The Anderson family estate had been in David's family for generations. It was a sprawling property, acres of land, a massive mansion, and a thriving investment company attached to the Anderson name. And for decades, everyone had assumed that David, as the only son, would inherit it. But after his parents disowned him, everything changed. His father, George Anderson, had spent months rewriting his will, ensuring that not a single penny of the family fortune would ever go to David, or his unacceptable family. But fate had other plans. One cold evening, David received an unexpected call. It was his mother. "David," Eleanor's voice trembled through the phone. "Your father, he's had a stroke." David froze. For a moment, he felt nothing. No anger, no sadness, no relief, just emptiness. His mother hesitated, then added, "He's asking for you." David sat down, exhaling slowly. "Are you sure?" "Yes," she whispered. "Please, David, come see him." Lisa walked into the room, noticing his expression. "What's wrong?" David looked up, conflicted. "My father," he murmured. "He wants to see me." Lisa sat beside him, gently taking his hand. "Do you want to go?" David didn't answer immediately. Did he? Did he owe his father anything? After everything he had done, cutting him off, trying to erase him, shaming him for loving his wife and kids, did he deserve forgiveness? And yet, some part of David needed answers. So he went. The final conversation. The hospital room was dimly lit. The beeping of machines filled the silence. David's father lay in bed, looking frail, nothing like the powerful businessman David had known his whole life. His face was pale, his once strong hands trembling. For the first time, George Anderson looked human. David stepped inside cautiously. His father's eyes flickered open. For a long moment, they just stared at each other. Then, in a voice weaker than David had ever heard, George spoke. "You came." David nodded, his face unreadable. His father exhaled shakily, then motioned for him to sit. "I don't have much time," George admitted. And I have regrets. David stiffened. You mean disowning me? Trying to erase me? Publicly humiliating me? His father's lips pressed together, guilt flashing in his aging eyes. I thought I was protecting the family name, George whispered. I thought I was doing what was right. David clenched his fists. And was it worth it? His father swallowed hard. No, he admitted. It wasn't. For the first time in his life, George Anderson looked small, defeated, broken. David exhaled slowly, forcing himself to speak. I loved you, Dad. I wanted your approval. I wanted you to accept my wife, my kids, but instead, you chose hate over love. And for what? To protect a legacy that doesn't even matter. His father's face twisted with regret. You're right, he whispered. And now, it's too late. David stared at him for a long moment. Then, in a voice calm but unyielding, he said, I forgive you. His father's breath hitched. But I don't forget. George nodded weakly, a single tear slipping down his wrinkled cheek. I was a fool, he admitted. But maybe you can do better. David swallowed the lump in his throat. I already am. His father smiled sadly. And then, for the first time in years, George Anderson reached out his hand. David hesitated, then took it. And in that moment, decades of anger, resentment, and pain faded away. Not completely, but enough. Enough for closure. Enough to move forward. And as David left the hospital that night, he knew one thing for sure. He had finally won. Not with revenge, not with hate, but with love, strength, and the family he had chosen. The will that changed everything. A week later, George Anderson passed away. And then something shocking happened. The family lawyer called David. Mr. Anderson, the lawyer said carefully, your father made some last-minute changes to his will. David frowned. What kind of changes? The lawyer cleared his throat. He left the entire estate to you. David's heart stopped. What? The lawyer nodded. Everything. The Anderson fortune. The estate. The business. He changed it just before he died. David sat in stunned silence. After everything, his father had finally seen the truth. David could practically hear the gasps of his extended family when they heard the news. The same people who had mocked him, rejected him, and shunned his wife and kids, now watching as he inherited everything they had fought to keep from him. Lisa's eyes widened when David told her. What are you going to do? She asked. David exhaled slowly. Something my father never did, he said. I'm going to use this money for something good. Lisa smiled softly. I knew you would. The legacy of love. With his newfound wealth, David didn't just continue his father's business. He changed it. He started a charity foundation to help underprivileged communities. He launched scholarships for minority students, ensuring that kids like Jasmine would never be denied opportunities. He built sports programs for kids like Malik, ensuring that no child was ever benched because of prejudice. And Lisa expanded her bakery into a full-fledged business, hiring single mothers and struggling families, giving them a fresh start. Their children grew up strong, confident, and proud, not of their wealth, but of their family's mission. And as David stood outside one evening, watching Jasmine, Malik, and Ella playing in the backyard, Lisa wrapped her arms around him. You did it, she whispered. David smiled. No, he corrected. We did it. Because in the end, it was never about the money, never about the name, never about the legacy his father tried to protect. It was about love. A love that had defied hate. A love that had changed lives. A love that had built a legacy stronger than any empire. And as David kissed Lisa under the setting sun, he knew one thing for sure. They had won. Not just for themselves, but for every family that had ever been told they weren't enough. Because love always wins. A love that shaped the future. The next chapter begins. Years had passed since David and Lisa first stood against the world. Since then, they had built something greater than themselves. The town that once whispered about them now celebrated them. The family that once rejected them had been replaced by a community that embraced them. Their love had not only endured, it had changed lives. But their journey was far from over. Because legacy isn't just about wealth. It's about who you become. And David and Lisa were about to find out just how powerful their love truly was. Jasmine's choice. Jasmine had always been the fighter. She had spent her teenage years defying expectations, proving that she was more than just the daughter of a black woman and a white man. She was brilliant. She was driven. And she was determined to make a difference. After earning a full scholarship to one of the country's top universities, she had a bright future ahead of her. But then, she did something unexpected. She turned it down. Lisa nearly dropped the coffee cup she was holding when Jasmine announced it. "You're what?" Lisa asked, eyes wide. Jasmine took a deep breath. "I got an offer," she said, "to work for a community development organization. They're launching a project to rebuild struggling neighborhoods. And I want to be part of it." Lisa exchanged a glance with David, who was just as stunned. "But Jasmine," David said carefully, "you've worked so hard for this scholarship." "I know," she said, "and I love school. But I don't need a degree to start making a difference." Lisa exhaled, setting down her cup. "You're just 18, baby. This is a big decision." Jasmine smiled softly. "You and Dad made a big decision when you chose each other. When you fought against all the people who said it wouldn't work. I want to fight for something too." David's heart swelled with pride. His daughter, had grown into a fearless, passionate woman. She wasn't just following their legacy. She was creating her own. Lisa reached across the table and took Jasmine's hand. "Then go change the world," she whispered. Jasmine grinned. "I will." Malik's moment of truth. If Jasmine was the fighter, Malik was the heart of the family. Ever since David became his stepfather, he had struggled to define himself. He wasn't just David Anderson's son. He wasn't just the black kid in a mostly white school. He was more than that. And he found his identity through sports. By the time he reached high school, Malik had become a star soccer player, breaking records and leading his team to championships. Scouts were watching. Colleges were offering full-ride scholarships. But just like Jasmine, he had a decision to make. One night, he sat with David on the front porch, staring at the sky. "Dad," he said quietly, "what if I don't want to go pro?" David turned to him, surprised. "Then you don't have to," he said simply. Malik looked down, fidgeting with his hands. "But everyone expects me to," he admitted. "The school, the scouts, even some of my teammates." David exhaled, leaning back. "Malik, listen to me," he said. "The world will always try to tell you who you should be, but you get to decide that." Malik hesitated, then looked up. "I love soccer," he said, "but I don't want it to be my whole life. I want to study psychology. I want to help kids like me, kids who grow up not knowing where they fit in." David's heart swelled with pride. "Then that's exactly what you should do." Malik let out a breath, as if a weight had been lifted. "Thanks, Dad." David smiled. "No, son. Thank you." Because in that moment, he realized something. Malik had already won his greatest battle. He had found who he was. And that was the greatest victory of all. Ella's big dreams. Little Ella was no longer so little. Now 12, she had grown into a bright, curious girl, one who carried her family's spirit of resilience. She wasn't just smart. She was brilliant. And she had big dreams. One day, she marched into the kitchen and made an announcement. "I'm going to be president one day," she declared. David nearly choked on his coffee. Lisa laughed, ruffling Ella's curls. "Oh, really?" Ella nodded firmly. "Yes, and when I am, I'm going to make sure nobody ever gets treated badly because of the color of their skin or who they love." David and Lisa exchanged a look, overwhelmed with pride. "You know what, baby?" Lisa said. "You'd make an incredible president." Ella grinned. "Yeah, I know." David laughed. And in that moment, he realized something. His kids, they weren't just following in his footsteps. They were becoming leaders in their own right. And that was the greatest legacy of all. A legacy that lasts forever. Years passed. David and Lisa grew older, but their love never faded. Their story had become more than just a love story. It was a lesson. A lesson about resilience. A lesson about fighting for what's right. A lesson about choosing love in a world full of hate. And the world had taken notice. The Anderson Foundation had become one of the leading charities in the country. Lisa's bakery had expanded into a nationwide business, giving jobs to hundreds of people. Jasmine had become a civil rights leader, fighting for equality across the country. Malik had become a youth counselor, guiding kids through struggles he had once faced himself. And Ella, well, nobody was laughing at her dream anymore. Because she had just been elected the youngest senator in the state's history. David and Lisa sat on their front porch, watching the sun set over their home. "You ever think we'd get here?" Lisa asked, leaning against David. He kissed her forehead, smiling. "Not in a million years," he admitted, "but I wouldn't trade it for anything." Lisa smiled, lacing her fingers with his. "Me neither." Because in the end, it wasn't just about them. It was about the legacy of love they had built, a legacy that would never fade, a legacy that would last forever. And as the stars appeared above them, David and Lisa knew one thing for certain. Their love had not only defied the odds, it had changed the world. Forever.